Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lisa Majeski, and I am going to be your facilitator today for this very, very important webinar on how to properly fill out and apply advanced beneficiary notices, and also how to apply insurance waivers in your practice. So we're going to get started right away. Just let me give you a little bit of introduction about myself. My name is Lisa Majeski, and I'm the president and owner of Gold Star Medical Business Services. Just a couple of items of housekeeping. I would ask that if you are on this call, make sure that you have yourself muted during the call. We will open it up towards the end for some Q&A. Hopefully, if we have enough time, we'll do that and be able to answer any questions that you have. But we're recording this session for those who cannot make it. And as a result, what I'd like to do is just make sure we have a nice, clean recording. I have been involved in the medical administration field for a number of years. And I teach these classes all the time throughout the United States. And I know that this is something that my clients with Gold Star Medical are very, very interested in and really struggle with sometimes. And so I thought this would be a good time to bring this tutorial to you. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, Gold Star Medical, just a little bit about our company. We are a full service revenue cycle billing and collections company, which means we do outsource billing for physicians and chiropractic offices throughout the United States. We have over 70 clients that we service, and we also do staff training and development. So for those of you who may be listening to this and you have a great billing team and you don't need to outsource your billing, then Gold Star Medical can help you with staff training. So if you have a new biller or you have a new front desk staff that comes into your practice and you don't have time to train them, you can call on us and we can schedule as much training as you absolutely need. So we'll go ahead and, if you're interested in the training and the development for your staff, please contact us. We also do practice consulting and this includes practice efficiency, ways for you to grow your practice, ways for you to market your practice, and so on and so forth. And so we have a number of different services that we are able and capable of giving you at any particular time that you need. So we hope that you will feel free to call on our services if you need us. Our contact information is on the screen, as well as our toll-free phone number. And I will let you know about how to contact us again toward the end of the presentation. But let's go ahead and get started on this presentation. So what this presentation is all about is protecting your money. You have to understand that insurance companies have many different benefit structures that they will apply to insurance policies for patients. And so it's not as simple when you're filing claims as just sending codes in with a value to those codes and then expecting that the insurance company is going to pay you. They're going to pay you based on a number of different factors. One is whether the services that you are billing for are medically necessary. And so, all of insurance billing and revenue cycle to insurance companies is based on this concept of medical necessity. They're not going to pay for a service that's not medically necessary, but they will also pay you based on something called the payer guidelines. And so medical necessity is essentially established through guidelines that the payers will write for the different medical procedures that they would normally cover under a patient's policy. Now, about 3 weeks ago, I taught a class on understanding payer guidelines, and that class was also on the Medicare LCDs, the local coverage determination documents, how to find them, how to interpret them, and so on and so forth. If you missed that webinar, you can go to our website, goldstarmedical.net, and then go to News and Events and click on that, and there will be a link to the recording of that webinar. So if you don't know a lot about payer guidelines, that's going to be a really important part of how you protect your money. And what I mean by protecting your money is you protect your money because you have claims that need to be filed, and they need to be filed in a way that the insurance company cannot argue with paying you for those services. I mean, obviously there may be services that will apply to a patient's deductible, or there's a co-insurance or a cost share. But what we don't want to see happen is we don't want to see your claims be denied for any other reason, like medical necessity reasons or failure to obtain an authorization or something like that. And so one of the ways that we protect our money is to make sure that we're giving patients proper notification of their financial responsibility toward that claim. It's very, very rare nowadays that insurance is going to cover 100% of a claim. I mean, it happens if a patient has a primary and a secondary plan from time to time, or if they have Medicare and a Medigap supplemental plan, it may be covered 100%. But for the commercial payers, even commercial payers where a patient has two insurances, let's say they're working and they have insurance and their spouse is working and their spouse has insurance, each of those plans may have a deductible that needs to be met or may have authorization requirements. And so very important to know the payer guidelines on how to and make sure you understand how to define medical necessity for the procedures that you bill for. And then also you need to make sure that you are verifying benefits on patients. What this helps you to do is it helps to explain to the patient their out-of-pocket costs, any deductibles or co-insurances or co-pays that they need to pay for their medical procedures. And then checking the different procedure codes that you may bill for will help you determine if pre-authorization is necessary or there are any special rules for filing those claims. Depending on what you find in the insurance verification, a patient may actually decide that it's not worth it to use their insurance, and they may want to pay cash for those services versus filing their insurance. Now, if that's the case, the question begs is, can we do that if we're in network with an insurance company? And the answer is yes, under certain conditions, and that's what we're going to talk about today as far as filing a waiver to file insurance. Also, depending on the verification and the payer guidelines, you may need to notify a patient in advance that a particular medical service that they want may not be covered by their insurance company, because under the contract that you have with the insurance company, if you don't let the patient know in advance that a certain procedure might not be covered, the patient might not be liable for paying for that. Meaning you bill the claim, and if the insurance company denies that claim, they would deny it as a contractual obligation, meaning you would have to write that off unless you've notified the patient in advance that the service may not get covered. So, and also, if you have a patient who decides they just want to pay cash for their services, but you have a contract with the insurance company that states that you are going to bill their insurance for these medical services, regardless of whether the patient has a $10,000 deductible or not, you have to bill based on your contract. And if you don't, and you don't obtain the proper waivers to file insurance, you could be in violation of your managed care contract and risk being kicked off of the plan. And so you certainly don't want that to happen. And you do not want to have to write off the entire balance of a claim and then refund the patient any money they've paid toward that procedure. That's the last thing you want to do. So what we want to do here is we want to make sure that your money is being protected. So the way we do this is with ABNs and waivers. The first thing we're going to talk about are the waivers to file insurance. Now, a waiver to file insurance is a form that a patient would sign if they wish to pay cash for services versus using their insurance. And this applies mainly to commercial plans, not Medicare, but commercial plans. ABNs are similar in nature, but these are for Medicare Part B patients. So an ABN stands for an Advance Beneficiary Notice, and this is a form that's used with Medicare B patients and Medicare A patients to notify them that a certain medical service or procedure that Medicare normally pays for might not be covered. You also have something called a voluntary ABN with your Medicare patients, and this would be a form that's used to notify Medicare patients of medical services that are statutorily not covered by Medicare. As we move through this class, I will show you the difference between the mandatory and the voluntary ABNs. Then we have the commercial ABNs. These have the same application as a Medicare ABN, except you're using the form that the commercial payer provides you. And so we're going to talk about all of these different forms today in the next hour. So what I'm going to do is we're going to try to do this using scenarios, because I think sometimes when I just explain things, here's how you do it, you still really don't get it and get how it needs to be applied. So we're going to take a scenario, and then we're going to break that scenario down. We're going to utilize this scenario in a number of different ways throughout our presentation today. So the scenario is this. You have a patient who comes in to have a series of hyaluronic acid injections. And again, what I want you to do is we have many different medical specialties on this call today. And so you plug your own procedure in here. It would be a procedure that Medicare would, or not Medicare, we're looking at waivers. So this would be a procedure that, that the patient would have, and it would be under the commercial plan. So it wouldn't be Medicare, but it would be a commercial plan. Under the payer guidelines, so the provider plans to do these injections with a drug called Supartz. And when you read the payer guidelines state that the procedure is covered for a diagnosis of osteoarthritis of the knees, and using the drug Supartz, the provider is allowed under the Supartz suggested utilization. They're allowed to do 3 to 5 injections per knee. This is called a series, and may repeat a series of injections after 6 months has elapsed. So that's your payer guideline. And by the way, this is also the same as the Medicare LCD would be the same as the payer guideline, because it's based on the drug code and what the recommended dosage is of the drug Supartz. The patient has to have both knees treated. So the average cost of this procedure is going to be $2,500 per series. So essentially it's going to cost the patient, if they do one knee, around $2,500, and they do all 5 injections, it would be about $2,500. 5 injections on the other knee, another $2,500. So you're looking at about $5,000 in allowable charges. And so if you were to verify the patient's benefits and you find out, number one, this is based on you being in network with the patient's plan. You do not have to do waivers for out-of-network plans because you're not required to file insurance if you're out of network. You can give the patient a walkout statement and they can take that and they can self-file. But when you're in network, you're required to file for the patient. But you find out that the patient has an $11,000 deductible, which has not been met. It's early in the year, or, this patient generally doesn't need enough medical services to ever meet their deductible unless they have a catastrophic type of health event. And so their deductible has not been met. So you notify the patient that if you bill their insurance, their out-of-pocket costs would be about $5,000 if both knees were done. You'd also advise the patients that they might, if they would like to, choose to pay cash for the services and receive a self-pay time of service discount of about $500. as long as they sign a waiver to file insurance. Now, the discount, you give them about a 10% discount, and that would reduce the out-of-pocket costs for them. So the patient agrees to the self-pay option. They say, you know what, that sounds good enough for me. I probably am never going to meet this $11,000 deductible, and so I'm okay with the cash rate. And now you also know that the general rules of contracts is that you are not to discount deductibles. Okay. However, if the patient would self-pay, then you can, because now you're not billing insurance. The patient is signing a waiver. And so this is what the waiver is and why the waiver is permitted. The waivers to file insurance are permitted as a result of a law that was passed 10 years ago called the HITECH Act, and is part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act law that was built into that law. And it was enacted in 2009. And what this law allows a patient to do is it allows them to prohibit a provider from sending protected health information to a health plan. And the health plan would be the insurance company. Without a waiver, the provider is required to file insurance as a provision of their contract with the payer. But the patient can elect and actually prohibit the provider from sending claim information to a payer under this provision under HITECH. And so this is an example of the insurance waiver. And it basically says that, and of course, you may have your own waivers in your office, and this is just a sample of one. Obviously, with all forms that I show you here, you want to check with your legal department to make sure that it meets the standards of legal and compliance. Some organizations may have a stricter standard than others. Some states, some federal plans may have a stricter standard, but this came directly from the Department of Health and Human Services as a sample insurance waiver. And so what it says is you place your practice information at the top so that the insurance company knows who this is coming from, and you're not having to send this to the insurance company unless they ask, but you certainly want to have your clinic information on there. The date, the patient information, and then you would write in the patient's name under I and the patient's date of birth. Then you would, in the second paragraph, or the first paragraph, you would type in the name of the practice. Second paragraph, you would type in the name of the insurance company and the name of the practice. Now, basically, it says, until such time as I might otherwise advise the healthcare practitioner or clinic in writing, I elect to pay for all services I receive from said practitioner out of my own pocket. Okay. By electing to self-pay, any payments I make to my provider will not be credited towards satisfying any deductible or coinsurance I may be subject to under my health insurance plan. So, what you can't do is, let's say a patient comes in with an $11,000 deductible, you offer them a discount on their deductible and then go ahead and bill insurance so that they can meet their deductible. That is not prohibited. You may never discount deductibles, coinsurance, or copayment amounts to a health plan or to Medicare if you are in network or you're participating with that plan. But what you can do is you cannot file at all and then offer the discount. Now, it states that also it says that the patient agrees not to retroactively self-file or request that the provider file claims should my deductible be met at a later time during my plan's benefit period. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that, let's say the patient signs the waiver at the beginning of the year because they have this $11,000 deductible, and halfway through the year, something happens. They have to go to the hospital for an operation, and during the course of their hospital stay, they meet their deductible and their out-of-pocket costs. Now they come back to you and say, hey, I met my deductible. Is there any way we can go back and go ahead and bill those claims that I had signed a waiver for? And the answer to that is no, you may not do that. If the patient signs the waiver, that they have no recourse to go back and file at a later time. So the patient needs to be aware of that, and you have to explain that very clearly to the patient so that they do not try to file those claims after the fact, by revoking the waiver and then saying, oh, well, I'm just going to go and try and file these claims on my own to try and get some money back from the insurance company. The waiver also should state that the patient has had an opportunity to ask any questions that they may have about the waiver. So that's very important as well, and that they completely understand what the ramifications of the insurance waiver is. This is just a little bit of a larger screenshot of the sample waiver, okay? And so it's very, very important that if you do elect, or the patient elects to pay cash for services that would normally be covered under their insurance, even if the patient has a high deductible, that they sign an insurance waiver. And if the patient chooses so, they can revoke the waiver at any time. And so this would be an example of a revocation of waiver. Now, there are some organizations in which every time the patient comes in for a service, they have to sign a waiver. And even if the service is exactly the same. Some will, for example, if you're under a series of treatments and you're going to have, let's say you're going to have those injections and you're going to have 5 injections, it is not necessary to sign the waiver every time the patient comes in for an injection. Some organizations require it, and that's fine. It's kind of a little overkill, probably not necessary, but again, better safe than sorry. And so the patient must, but however, in order to stop having the patient pay cash, and at any point if the patient decides they would like to start billing their insurance, then they must sign the revocation of waiver. And this is an example of the revocation form. I will be more than happy to send any of you copies of these forms, examples of the forms if you would like them. And all you have to do is email me, info@goldstarmedical.net. Just say, I saw the webinar today on ABNs and waivers, and I'm interested in the sample waiver and sample revocation of waiver forms. That also goes for any of the sample ABN forms that you're going to see here on the following slides. So that is how we apply the insurance waivers, and under which conditions would we have the patient sign a waiver to file insurance. Remember that waivers are only good under commercial plans in which you are in network. Medicare would have a different type of scenario. This would be an ABN form, and it would be dependent on the option that they choose under the ABN form as to whether you waive the insurance filing on a Medicare patient. So let's kind of take a look at your Medicare patients now. We're going to look at the same scenario, but now we're looking at a Medicare Part B patient who's coming in to have a series of hyaluronic acid injections, and the provider plans to inject with Suparts, which is the hyaluronic acid derivative. The Medicare LCD says that this procedure is covered for a diagnosis of osteoarthritis of the knees. Using Suparts, the provider is allowed to do 3 to 5 injections per knee, which is called a series, and may repeat a series of injections after 6 months has elapsed. The patient needs to have both knees treated. So here we go. The patient has, in this scenario, the patient has completed the first series on both knees, helped them tremendously. They were pain-free after they received the injections. But now 4 months has elapsed. The patient's knees are starting to bother them again, and they're getting ready to go overseas on an extended 3-week vacation. They're going to be walking all over Italy and walking up and down stairs, and they feel like, wow, my knees are starting to bother me again. Maybe I should have another series of injections before I go. The problem is that under the Medicare LCD, the patient must wait 6 months before they can have another series of injections paid by Medicare. So the Medicare patient calls you and says, hey, I would like to have another series of injections. I'm fixing to go overseas. My knees are starting to bother me. Is there any way I can schedule these injections next week? And your answer to that patient is yes. However, Medicare will only cover these injections, a repeat series of injections, after 6 months has elapsed. And we notice that only 4 months have elapsed since you had your first series of injections. So what we're going to have you do is we have a form that you will need to sign called an advanced beneficiary notice. And in this form, you need to decide whether you want to bill Medicare or and see what Medicare says, or pay cash for the services, or not have the services. And so you would tell the patient this. Now, this is a sample of the Medicare ABN form. And Medicare actually provides a really, really nifty interactive tutorial on how to fill out an ABN form and when it should be used. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes actually going through this tutorial with you. And then we're going to come back to it. So let's go ahead and click on that link. All I did was I clicked on the link on the slide, and it takes me right to this tutorial. You can click for a print friendly version, and it will give you a PDF of this. But really, where what the cool thing is about this tutorial is that you can do this right here online. So first of all, you can look at the different sections. So if you click on the different sections will open up a more detail on each of the sections of this tutorial, of the interactive tutorial. And so, or you can click on the different links. So if you click on, for example, the link Advanced Beneficiary Notice of Non-Coverage, what that will do is that will actually take you to a zip drive that you can open up. And then it gives you all the ABN forms that you could possibly need for your practice. It gives you English in large print. It gives you both the Word document and the PDF document. It gives you the English version and the Spanish version and the Spanish large print version. So if you have a significant Hispanic population where a lot of people don't speak English, you can actually have the ABNs done in Spanish and in English, and you can customize them for your practice. So if you use the Word document, you can open up the Word document, and this is the large print, I believe. Here we go. You can open up that Word document and you can customize it. So you can essentially, where it says notifier, you put your clinic information there, and you can customize it with the different medical procedures that you may need an ABN form, and type in the procedure, the reason why Medicare may not pay, the estimated cost, and so on and so forth. So you can actually customize these forms, which is pretty nifty. And so it gives you, number one is it gives you that zip drive that you can, where you can pull all of these forms. If you want to, in the tutorial itself, if you want to expand any of these topics, you can click on the link, or you can click on the tab, and these are both one and the same. So if you click on the tab, this gives you an introduction. It tells you what an ABN is used for, and basically it says that this form helps a Medicare fee-for-service, which is Part A and Part B beneficiary, make an informed decision about items and services that Medicare usually covers but may not pay because they're medically unnecessary. If a beneficiary does not get written notice when required, they may not be financially liable if Medicare denies payment, and the provider may be financially liable. So what this means is that if you don't do your due diligence in getting an ABN signed by your patient and Medicare denies the claim, then you are liable for the write-off. You would have to do a complete 100% write-off of that claim, and you would have to refund the money, any money that the patient has paid in, their coinsurance amounts or their deductible amounts. These ABNs are for physicians, independent labs, SNFs, home health agencies providing Medicare outpatient services, hospice providers, HHAs, and religious non-medical healthcare institutions providing Part A services. Okay, so we can close this introduction window, and if we come back here, this talks about the background. So the background on this, it talks about common reasons why Medicare might deny a claim is not medically necessary. Experimental and investigational or considered research only, not indicated for the diagnosis or treatment in this case. So for example, going back to our scenario, we know that the Medicare LCD for hyaluronic acid therapy injections is limited to osteoarthritis of the knees. Now you decide that you want to try this hyaluronic acid therapy regimen on a patient for their shoulder. Medicare does not cover that. They cover it only that hyaluronic acid therapy is only covered for osteoarthritis of the knees. It's not covered for shoulders. For shoulders, you have to use a corticosteroid. And so that would be a time where you would issue an ABN. So I gave you one scenario as far as the elapsed time, but there are other reasons why you might have an ABN signed for that particular medical procedure. More than the number of services Medicare allows in a specific period for the corresponding diagnosis. Now that is the 4-month problem that we looked at in our scenario. Okay, Medicare only allows one series every 6 months, and we're now the patient is asking for more than the number of services Medicare allows in a specific period. So there are a number of things that would cause a Medicare you to do an ABN on a Medicare patient. Another one would be for the outpatient therapy caps. So if you do physical therapy under Medicare has a cap, an outpatient therapy cap, and if these outpatient therapy services don't qualify for the exception, there is a therapy cap exception. If they don't qualify for that exception, then you would have the patient sign an ABN for those additional physical therapy services, or you would be financially liable for writing off anything that Medicare deems not medically necessary beyond that physical therapy cap or the cap exception. So you can read more by going into this tutorial about what some of the different scenarios are in which you would have to fill out a mandatory ABN. One of the other things to note about the background of the ABN is that you do not use an ABN, and you can see this right in the middle of your screen here. I'm just going to use my drawing tool to show this to you. It says do not use an ABN for items and services under Medicare Advantage plans or the Medicare prescription drug plans. If the patient has a Medicare replacement or Medicare Advantage, the ABN form is not a valid form. You actually have to go to that Medicare Advantage plan itself and find their ABN for these types of services. It doesn't mean you don't do an ABN. It just means that ABN, that type of ABN, the CMS R131, is not valid for anything other than Medicare Part A or Part B. Now, if there are services that are not a covered benefit under Medicare, okay, so for example, that we may have some chiropractic offices listening in, And the chiropractic offices, basically the only thing Medicare pays for is spinal manipulation. So chiropractors may do exams with Medicare patients or x-rays or physical therapy services. These are considered statutorily non-covered services, meaning Medicare never covers them, at least not now. That may change here in the next few months to few years, but for right now, that's their non-covered services. And so you're not required to do an ABN for non-covered services. There is a form that you may use called a voluntary ABN. So you may issue a voluntary ABN or a similar notice as a courtesy to alert the beneficiary about their financial liability. So the voluntary ABN is simply really would be more of an informational type of form. There used to be a form that Medicare had called NEMB, Notice of Exclusion of Medicare Benefits, that they don't use anymore. But you may use, again, Medicare says that you may issue a voluntary ABN or a similar notice. So if you still have the NEMB forms, you can use them. Medicare doesn't recognize those anymore. However, because they say similar form, you could use the NEMB, but I will show you how to use the voluntary ABN forms, how to alter your existing ABN forms to create a voluntary ABN. Okay, the other thing you need to be aware of under the ABNs is that they are valid. Number one is you must use the most recent version of the ABN, which is the 2020 version. Okay, and you'll see the version at the bottom of the form. So make sure you have the most recent version. If you're using an outdated version of the ABN, then it's not going to be considered to be valid under an audit. If you use a single ABN for an extended course of treatment for no longer than 1 year. So basically what this is saying is that an ABN is really only good for a 1-year period if a patient is receiving an extended course of treatment. It's also valid only if you complete the entire form, meaning you don't leave anything blank that doesn't need to be blank, and ensure that the beneficiary understands the meaning of the notice. Also goes on to say that if the beneficiary refuses to sign an ABN or they refuse to choose an option, you should annotate the original copy indicating the refusal to choose an option or sign the ABN. You can list any witnesses to the refusal, but it's not required. And Medicare does state that if a beneficiary refuses to sign a properly issued ABN, consider not furnishing the item or service unless the consequences, meaning the health and safety of the beneficiary or civil liability case of harm, prevent this option. So these are the criteria under which you would want to issue an ABN. Now let's take a look at the interactive tutorial. So if we click on the interactive tutorial, this is wicked cool. I think so. Anyway, I really had fun playing with this today. And so what you can do is all of these items here that are highlighted, if you click on it, it opens it up and gives you exactly what to put in on the notice. It says the notifiers must place their name, address, and telephone number at the top of the notice. So that's interesting. The information may be incorporated into a notifier's logo. What I see a lot is sometimes it just has the name of the clinic. It doesn't have the address or the phone number. Medicare could, if they're being picky, and auditors will, because they obviously are looking for any excuse not to pay a claim, they could decide to invalidate the ABN if you don't have all the information that Medicare is requiring, okay? And so every single one of these items, it tells you exactly how to fill this information out. Now, for time's sake, we're not going through all of this. I'm going to show you some examples here in just a second. Oh, let me see if I can get this out of here. Let's escape. Oh, come on. My screen let's see if my screen doesn't go down all the way. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get out of this real quick. I'm going to open this back up, and then I'm going to open it up again. All right, here we go. So anyway, this interactive tutorial will give you full explanations of how to fill out every open item of the ABN form. So be sure for every medical procedure you render in your service, in your clinic, that Medicare might cover, or that is covered under the Medicare plan for Part A or Part B, you have an ABN prepared for that medical service, okay? You cannot put different medical services and mix them up all into one ABN form. So, you may, for example, you may do knee injections and trigger point injections and all different kinds of pain management services. You would not list all of those services under one ABN. It would be for one service, one type of service, one ABN. So be aware of that, okay? There are more resources that you can look at under this interactive tutorial. And so I would definitely encourage you to use that interactive tutorial if at all possible. Now let's go ahead and move on and take a look at, this is an example of how your ABN would be filled out. So for example, and I've only done this partially, so for example, here we are. We have the notifier would be the name of the clinic, their address and phone number. And if you're going to want to pre-populate the form, you would populate it with all the information as to what the procedure is, okay, and why Medicare might not pay. So this is arthrocentesis knee injections, HCPC, and we call in Medicare CPT codes are called HCPC codes. So HCPC code 20610, and then SUPARTS, which is the HCPC code J7321 for the SUPARTS. And it says Medicare will only pay 3 to 5 injections per knee when medically necessary for osteoarthritis of the knee. Medicare will only cover a series of injections once every 6 months if medically necessary. And then you explain it's only been 4 months. They're only going to cover this once every 6 months. You would put in the estimated cost for both the injection and the drug, and then you would have the patient choose an option. So after you explain what the ABN says, you would let the patient know that they need to read through this. You give them a few minutes to do so. They need to read through this, and they need to choose one of 3 options in section G. You tell them, and you must be very clear about this, that you cannot make a choice for them, all right? And you are not allowed to guide them to a choice, okay? You simply give them the ABN form, tell them to read through it, and let them know that you cannot make a choice for them, but they need to go ahead and make a choice right now. They might decide to take it home and, bring it back. You reschedule their appointment if that's what you have to do. It very rarely happens, but if it's a significant enough procedure, they may decide that they want to think about it, before they make an election, and that's fine. You can let them know that if they have any questions about the different options, that you would be happy to answer their questions. But folks, you have to make sure that you do this right, because I have seen situations where ABNs were, the office would say, well, you're just going to want to pay cash for this so you can get the discount, and so you need to choose option 2. You cannot do that. All right, you have got to make sure that you let the patient make a free election, because and Medicare will check. So they will check with patients about these ABNs, and they'll ask the patient if they felt they were coerced into one option over another. And if they say yes, then Medicare could invalidate that ABN, and you would be required to write off all of those services. So this is definitely something Medicare checks on. You have got to make sure you do not coerce the patient in any way, shape, or form. Now, if the patient says, well, if I choose option 1, or I choose option 2, is there a difference in cost? Then you can say, yes, there would be a difference in cost. If you choose option 2, you would pay cash. And since we're not incurring any administrative costs, there would be we could give you a bookkeeping discount or a time of service discount of 10% for the cash services. Now that would, and if they ask you, you can tell them, but you may not, and hopefully I've driven it in enough times, but you may not, in any way, shape, or form, give an impression of coercing the patient to one or the other of the options. Under option 3, basically, at that point, they say they don't want the services, then you would notate that in the, in the patient's record, and you would, just basically release the patient and let them know that if they change their mind, then they can reschedule an appointment. Now, the thing about option 3 is that there is a measure of liability on your part that you have to be careful about. If you feel the medical procedure that the patient is supposed to have is going to, the withholding of that treatment is going to be cause significant morbidity or mortality, or it could even, result in the death of the patient if they don't have this procedure, if this procedure is emergent in nature, or somewhat emergent in nature, not life-threatening like this very second, but it could be if they don't have the procedure, then you would probably want to have the provider sit down with the patient and do an informed consent consult and let the doctor notate in the record the fact that they have consulted the patient as to what the medical ramifications would be for refusing that service, to include the risk of increased illness. Their symptoms could get worse, significantly worse, or it could even result in their death if they refuse the treatment. So you would definitely want to be very careful when they choose option 3 to notate that you counseled the patient on the ramifications for refusal of treatment. For those of you who are chiropractors, since we do have a lot, I just wanted to show you what the ABN form would look like for chiropractic services. Since spinal manipulation is the only service that is covered under Medicare for chiropractic services, the only ABN form that you are responsible for having patient fill out, Medicare Part B, is for the spinal manipulations, and those are CPT codes 98940, 98941, and 98942. And the reason why Medicare would not cover, most of the time your ABN form is going to relate to maintenance therapy, that Medicare does not cover maintenance therapy for spinal manipulation, and you would give the cost of those CMT codes. On the claim, these are the modifiers that relate to ABNs. So you have modifier GA, which is a waiver of liability. GY is statutorily non-covered service. GX means that a voluntary ABN was issued for a statutorily non-covered service. And GZ means not medically necessary, and you did not obtain an ABN. So if you use the first 3 modifiers, and if we go back to the ABN form itself, you look under the 3 options. Option 1, basically the patient is stating that they want the services and they want Medicare to be billed for a determination of coverage. Option 2 says they want the services but do not bill Medicare, okay? And they have no appeal rights. Option 1 is you can bill Medicare and they do have appeal rights, okay? Now, if the patient chooses option 1, then you would bill the service with a GA modifier, meaning that you obtained a waiver of liability. And what this does is it will it will kick the denial over to the patient responsibility instead of the contractual obligation for the provider to have to write that claim off. A GY is when you bill Medicare for statutorily non-covered services, and sometimes you have to do that because a patient may have something called a true secondary plan in which Medicare might not cover the service, but their secondary, not a Medigap plan, because a Medigap plan usually follows the Medicare guidelines, and if the Medigap if Medicare doesn't cover the service, the Medigap doesn't cover the service. But some patients have true secondaries, like federal Blue Cross Blue Shield retirees will have a true Medicare secondary, and there may be services that Medicare wouldn't cover that their Blue Cross plan might. So you would have to bill the service to Medicare first with a GY modifier so it is denied correctly to patient responsibility, and then you could go ahead and bill the secondary payer for that. And GX, again, is that the voluntary ABN is issued. So if you're submitting statutorily non-covered services to Medicare and you did obtain an ABN, then you would use two modifiers, the GY and the GX modifier. The GZ modifier is if you did not obtain an ABN. Remember, if you use a GZ modifier and Medicare denies it, they will be denying it to a contractual obligation, meaning, you're basically admitting that you didn't get an ABN, and Medicare is going to make you responsible for writing that off. So be aware of that. Here's a sample of a voluntary ABN. Notice it's the same form, okay? But you'll notice that on this voluntary ABN, because we're simply notifying the patient of different treatments that Medicare might not cover, you would put your codes on there. The reason why Medicare would not pay is these services are not covered by Medicare when referred or performed by a doctor of chiropractic. Then you put your estimated cost in, and you'll notice that what you would do is on your Word document, you would strike out the options because the patient doesn't have to choose an option under a voluntary ABN. You would simply write in under the additional information, it says this notice is for informational purposes to inform you of your financial responsibility should you choose to have these services. You are not required to select an option from Section G. Patient would read through that and then they can sign and date it. And that essentially works as like a financial policy for you, and you would want the patient to have a copy of that. Now, commercial ABNs, to finish up, now these have their own versions of an ABN. Some commercial payers will have their own versions of an ABN. Some Medicare Advantage payers will have ABNs. One of the things that it's very important you do is for any of the plans that you're in network with, you need to investigate which of your payers have their own versions of ABN forms and under which circumstances would you have a patient sign one. Most of the time you're going to have a patient sign a commercial ABN if you're furnishing services that are outside of the payer guidelines or the medical policy for that particular medical service, furnishing services that are deemed experimental by the payer, or furnishing services that are non-covered services by the payer. So let's look at this scenario. The Blue Cross Blue Shield patient comes in to have a series of therapeutic injections for arthritis in the hip using ultrasound guidance. The provider plans to inject with Traumeal, a homeopathic drug with an unclassified drug code of J3490. Now, under the payer guidelines for Blue Cross Blue Shield, this procedure is covered for diagnosis of osteoarthritis of the hip. And so the patient, it says in the scenario that they are coming in for arthritis in the hip. Okay, so that's good. The drug codes, however, that would be approved for this procedure are corticosteroids. So the only drugs that are approved for this procedure for osteoarthritis of the hip are corticosteroid drugs. And this provider plans on using a homeopathic drug called Traumeal. Now, since the provider is using a homeopathic drug, the payer under the guideline classifies this procedure as prolotherapy, which they deem to be experimental or investigational. Now, they don't come out and say in this particular payer guideline that it's not covered. They just say that it's experimental. Some patients' plans, insurance plans, will cover experimental procedures under certain conditions, if certain conditions are met. But there's enough of a risk to an experimental procedure that you would want to have an advance notice of non-coverage signed by the patient just in the event that the payer denies it. So if the patient, since the patient is wanting to do a procedure that's considered by the payer to be experimental, a commercial ABN should be issued in the event the payer denies the claim. Now, here's an example of one. This actually comes from Blue Cross Blue Shield of Arizona. Again, we have in Arizona, we have several Arizona clients, and so we went in as a billing company and we found some of the commercial payer ABNs for our clients. And so this is one that I have on file. I wanted to show it to you. Here's the kicker. The policy states, Blue Cross Blue Shield medical policy state, that if you don't use their form for advance notice of non-coverage and you use some kind of a generic form or a generic statement in your intake document stating that if a procedure is denied by the insurance company that the patient agrees to be financially responsible, this payer says that's not good enough. Unless you use their form, it's invalid and you would be required under your contract to write off those services that they don't pay for. So that's how important it is for you to try to find the payer's forms. Now, not all payers have these payer-specific advanced beneficiary notices, but you have to go and look for them first. And you could call the insurance company directly and ask them if they have a form, such a form, and they could help you find one as well if you can't find one. This is a generic one that I actually, took from the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Arizona form and reconfigured it so that it is generic. So this way, if the payer does not have a form, this form is specific enough that it could be utilized in the same way if the payer denies the claim as experimental or not medically necessary. And so it basically does the same thing that the ABN does. You list the patient's, your clinic information, your clinic name, address, city, state, zip, advance notice of non-covered services. You put the patient information at the top, the medical service or treatment that you're rendering, and any additional information about that treatment goes in the white box down at the bottom of the second table. And then after that, you would fill in, customize it for your clinic. And then the patient makes a choice. They want the services and they want the payer to be billed. They don't want the services and they will pay cash for those services, or they do not want to have the services. And then the patient would sign that form. This is an example of how you would fill out the generic form for that hip injection for Traumeal. So the service you see is the joint injection of the hip, the billing code 20611, arthrocentesis with ultrasound guidance, the estimated cost, and then you would list the Traumeal, the billing code, the estimated cost of that, and then the patient would have to make an election. If they wanted to pay cash, then they could be afforded a cash discount. The question always comes, I'm always asked the question as to whether we should bill the service with a GA modifier. GA modifier is a modifier. It is a Medicare modifier. It's a Medicare modifier that says advanced beneficiary notice on file. But most commercial payers, if you do experimental services and you've done a commercial ABN, they will ask you to bill that experimental service with a GA modifier, because it doesn't say advanced beneficiary notice on file, Medicare only. It is a modifier that can be used for commercial payers. Now, if you're not sure, though, whether these experimental services may or may not be covered, you can leave the modifier off. If the claim then is denied, though, as not medically necessary, you'll get a denial. It'll say CO50, not medically necessary. Then you might have to do a corrected claim and add the GA modifier and request that the claim be reprocessed and denied as a PR55, which is patient responsible for an experimental procedure. So that this is a process that you're going to need to decide based on what you see coming out of these payers. You know, if you know it doesn't matter, the payer is not going to pay for this experimental procedure, then just have the patient sign the ABN right away, and you know, and then bill it with the modifier so you get the correct and proper denial, and it's denied to patient responsibility. Okay, so that concludes our presentation today. I will stop the recording here, and for those of you who do want to stay on and will ask any questions that you might have, it's just a little bit after 1 o'clock Central Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Time, but I do want to let you know that our next scheduled webinar will be in a few weeks on Tuesday, October 8th at 12 o'clock Central, 1 o'clock Eastern Time. It's going to be on ICD-10 coding, the update for 2019-2020. The new ICD-10 codes come into effect October 1st. So if there are any updates to the ICD-10 code book, they're going to take effect October 1st. That's the way the government fiscal year works. And we'll talk about some of the basic ICD-10 coding guidelines and conventions. You're free to attend this webinar. This particular webinar today will be converted, and the recording will be on the Gold Star Medical website within the next 24 hours. If you have any questions about this presentation today, feel free to call me. My number is here on the screen, my email, my website, and our Facebook page if you want. And if you would like to tweet us as well, we have a Twitter account, Medical Billers at Gold Star Med. Thank you all for attending today. I am going to remain open with this presentation, but stop the recording and unmute you all for any questions that you might have. Thank you so much, and have a great day.